Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Pleasure to put it together for you every week at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find out more about all of the things we have going on through this very tumultuous special session of the Virginia General Assembly. White papers, advocacy that we've been putting together, outreach to even members of the Democratic Party caucus to try to build coalition around right answers. It's what we do here. It's why we call ourselves a do tank. Find out more about us in general, virginiainstitute.org, and you can find archived editions of Freedom and Prosperity Radio on our YouTube channel. Search Freedom and Prosperity Radio at youtube.com. Our next guest is the Director for Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Yuval Levin is on with us. He has a brand new book out called Time to Build. Yuval, thank you for taking some time out with us. I love your title. As I read it, I said, what, is that it? There was nothing else he could be in charge of at the American Enterprise Institute? How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much for having me.
I wanted to jump in on a question, and we heard this out of Kenosha. The uncle of the young man that was killed, that became the flashpoint that led to so much of the rioting there, blamed the president and said, we need a president that will unite us. And that phrase is a commonplace phrase. We hear it, especially around election times. But every time I hear it, it irks me somewhat, because it reminds me that we're looking for other people to do things for us. We can't wait for a president or a congressman or a governor to unite us. We have to unite ourselves one person at a time. And I know that sounds kind of hippie and 60s, but it seems to be the source of your book. It's Time to Build, subtitle From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. But it seems like that really is, in essence, what you're talking about, is instead of waiting for the university president to unite us, we need to unite ourselves one at a time.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And it's not a hippie thing for me at all. It's, in fact, the essence of my own conservatism, which is the belief that ultimately people live their lives at the level of the interpersonal, at the level of family and community, at the level of the local, and that what we build in terms of national institutions and structures grows out of that and exists in order to protect that space where we really live. And that means that we have to solve our problems from the bottom up and not just stand around with our arms folded waiting for just the right person to get elected in Washington to solve them. So that even problems like what we're seeing now, problems of political culture, of polarization, and inability to work together towards solving problems, we've got to ask ourselves how we, where we are, might help that happen, and also how we might demand it more effectively of people in positions of power. It can't just be about them. We have to think about our country in terms of us and ours and we, or else we'll never get our problems solved.
Well, it seems to be the magic formula that has made this, American experiment, as the academics like to call it, work, is that the government wasn't going to try to get into every minute little piece of our lives, and they were going to let, if it's a government function, the local government, or if it was just an interpersonal thing, the interpersonal deal with those things on their own level.
Absolutely. I think that's really essential to understanding how our society has functioned when it's functioned best. And one of the things that enables us to do is solve problems in different ways in different places. This is a diverse country. We live in a time when people do differ about some very basic questions. And the fact is, we don't have to agree in order for this society to work. We have to agree on a few basic things, on core rights and principles. But within that, there's a lot of room for people to live differently in different places, to experiment with different ways of solving problems. And if these things can happen from the bottom up, we can learn from each other. And look, if the people who run California find a great way to solve a public problem, Virginia could learn from them and vice versa. But it just doesn't have to be the case that there's only one way to address these things. And that kind of centralization makes it much harder to solve problems.
Is there also on a community level, Yuval, I'm going to go back to a story that I've told before on the show of August 12th, 2017. Our flagship city is Charlottesville, and I was in the middle of the riots because I wanted to be able to tell the real story, because I knew that we were going to be inundated with people who had never been to Charlottesville telling people what was happening in Charlottesville. And I happened to bump into a young man who was caught up in the mob mentality, and he and I were going to fight. And it was actually the president of Black Lives Matter that interceded, because he had come to know me individually. And he said, no, he's not a racist. He's cool. And I was struck by that. But more so after the fact, I bumped into the young man after kind of the protest, and David Duke was out of town and that kind of thing. And he was walking along our downtown mall, and he was the nicest, most intellectual young man. He was Columbia University student. And I was thinking, here's this guy that, an hour earlier was this wild-eyed rioter, and he's collegial. He was apologetic, and I think we not only do we do ourselves a disservice when we don't get to know each other individually, but when we get into mob think, either we are allowing our lesser angels out because we don't think anyone will notice, or we just kind of go to the lowest common denominator. Do you find the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's quite right. And one of the reasons that seems to happen more and more in our own time, I think, has to do with the fact that we mediate our experience of one another through social media increasingly, and that forces us to see ourselves in very bizarre and distorted ways, so that interpersonal connections can overcome a lot of what we think of as political, even cultural differences. We can recognize one another's humanity in ways that makes it possible for us to work together and solve problems. When we insist on seeing each other through these kinds of forms of mediation that, first of all, say this person is of another party or of another race or of another culture, and therefore there's nothing between us except difference, that makes it very difficult for us to work together as neighbors, as fellow citizens. I think that happens when our politics becomes overly nationalized, where we don't actually see particular human beings, but it also happens when it comes to be channeled through technology in ways that aren't necessary. If you both live in Charlottesville, there's not a reason why you should see each other through these frames and categories that impose themselves politically. But it's very hard to avoid that now. That kind of culture war mentality is everywhere in all of our institutions, and we really have to work at overcoming it.
Tribalism, I think, as I've heard it called that.
Yep.
Does the coronavirus shutdowns, which we're beginning to debate more and more as to whether they should be going on longer or not, have they exacerbated that, Yuval?
Yes, I think so, because naturally we now can't really encounter each other as much in an interpersonal way. So even more of our lives are mediated, whether that's by technology or in other forms. And certainly, it makes it hard for us to work together at the local level. It makes it hard for us to encounter other people. And we've also seen that tribalism, as you say, the kind of culture war that dominates everything, has come to dominate how we think about the public response to the pandemic. And everything becomes politicized, becomes a kind of test of party loyalty, and it does become very difficult to solve real problems that way.
It's almost like it's grassroots fascism. I know they call it the counter. Yuval Levin is the director of the American Enterprise Institute Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department. He's got a new book out, and is the best place to go buy it, Yuval, at American Enterprise Institute? I believe it's aei.org, or is it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual?
You can find the book on Amazon, and you can find all of the work that I do at aei.org, and a lot of work my colleagues do on all of these questions we're talking about.
And please support what they do because it's important that we remind ourselves sometimes, and I think this is a great book for younger people. I hope college campuses get a good hold of this. One of the things we were talking about just before was the idea that we get into these technological bubbles and we kind of lose our ability to just have that human contact with it. But that American dream, I hear it from political leaders. We're a wealthy nation. We are this nation. We are that nation. We're actually a free nation full of individuals who have created prosperity, but we're not a wealthy nation. This idea that insert adjective to the word nation, I think almost leads us to homogenize ourselves and dehumanize ourselves. Is that a fair point?
Well, I certainly think there are some core ideals that hold us together as a society, and there's also a common history that enables us to understand ourselves as belonging to one nation. But among those core ideals is a commitment to the dignity of the individual and to the capacity of the individual to create opportunity for others by pursuing his or her own good. And that's just essential to our way of life, so that tension between the individual and the community has always been part of the American story. And, in some ways, if we ask ourselves, what kind of nation are we as a whole, we are, among other things, a nation that respects individuals, and it is something that distinguishes us in the world.
And I grew up in one of the great melting pot cities of the world, New York City, in a time when nobody took any umbrage if you went to Little Italy to find good food or a wine. But now we seem to almost take umbrage when somebody says, "Oh, I want to go down to Chinatown, or I want to go to Little Italy," and we say, "Oh no, that you can't say that because it's either cultural appropriation or it's racist in some way." Has that hurt us as a society, our ability to say, hey, this is just a great place to go for some great food?
Yeah, look, I think that the motto of our country, chosen in the moment of the founding, e pluribus unum, out of many one, speaks to the potential of a diverse society to strengthen itself by drawing precisely on the differences among its people, not seeing those differences as sources of division, but as sources of strength. And I think we've got to be able to see that. Cultural appropriation, that's just another way of saying civilization, right? I think it's just ridiculous to see that as an insult or a violation somehow. It's a way of learning from one another, of saying that people who come from a different cultural background have something to offer me, and I can use it to build on what I have to offer them. That's the strength of our kind of free society. So I do think we lose a lot when we deny ourselves the potential that it offers.
Talk about the work that went into putting this effort together, and the places you've gone to find the narrative in this book.
Well, it's a book about the condition of American institutions, and so it certainly results from a lot of experience traveling the country and talking to people in academic institutions, in political and civic institutions, in people who work around politics. And ultimately, they're just patterns that present themselves that emerge over time that suggest to you that the loss of confidence that we've seen in our core institutions over the years has a lot to do with a loss of the sense that these institutions form people to be capable of freedom, that they make us better. And when we think of them only as platforms for performance, as places to stand and shout, we lose a great deal of what they have to offer us. I got to see this especially in universities, and at the center of the book is really a chapter that expresses a deep concern about the condition of the American academy. I think our universities, which are so important for shaping the rising generation of American leaders, are in terrible intellectual shape. They've lost their sense of purpose, the idea that they exist to connect the rising generation with what our civilization has to offer them, with the best of our traditions. They now see themselves as trying to block that path, to disconnect the rising generation from our tradition. And I think we lose so very much when that happens. And so concern about that institution is really in some ways at the center of the argument.
It's funny, as you were describing the work into this, I wrote the word universities down because it seemed like that's where you're going to, and I wanted to ask about that because, I'm not that old, although my wife might argue. And when I went to college, the idea was that was to if you hadn't yet, figure out what it is you're good at doing and then find a way to go forth and serve your community with that, and you would be compensated, obviously, for it. That's the essence of it. But now it's become more almost like a vending machine. Insert your, unfinished business here, and we'll print out or pop out a finished citizen on the other end ready to go to work in X, Y, or Z. And I don't know where it became so almost industrial rather than academic, where you're out there probing and trying to find and figure out things. It's just become almost like data entry.
Yeah, I think that's one powerful trend that we've seen in the life of the American university. A push toward a kind of homogenization too, and away from traditional academic culture. And of course, another is that we've seen the universities become more and more platforms for political expression, like so many of our other institutions have, where the idea increasingly is not that you are there to be shaped, but that you are there to express yourself, and to ultimately play a part in the culture war that dominates so many of our institutions. And one of the things that does is eliminate the distinct contribution that an academic institution can make. It shaves away the differences between our different sorts of institutions. So the New York Times is a newspaper. Brown University is an academic institution. At this point, those are both just places to stand and yell about oppression. There's not enough of a difference between them. They both exist to channel a certain kind of political energy. And I think we lose a great deal when our different kinds of institutions come to all understand themselves in this same way. It's yet another form of homogenization, and the cost we pay for it is quite real.
Is the implied endorsement of a crowd something we have sold our individuality to? So we all want to be right, I guess, is the essence of it. And somehow having a big crowd of people, whether it be on Facebook and followers or in a room listening to you lecture or standing behind you as you give a political speech, is an implied endorsement that this is correct. Is that a weakness that we have to learn to strengthen ourselves against, allowing to take us over?
It's, of course, a long-standing problem for the human species. We care about affirmation. We do want to be approved of, and that can be a good thing, too. It's what helps to shape us to be civilized people. But I think there's no question that the forms by which we live our lives now as citizens, and it's a function of social media in part, it's a function of other kinds of technological changes and cultural changes, we do find ourselves seeking broad affirmation in some very unusual ways. Social media, in a sense, it creates a kind of micro-celebrity culture. We each become our own paparazzi. We hound ourselves for photographs. And as we're living our lives, we imagine what other people will say when we post this and whether we can get a lot of likes. That is a very deforming way to live. And it robs us of the freedom to experiment even in our own lives, and compels us to seek the approval of a broad and vaguely defined group, which means that it ultimately is a kind of constraint, right? It's peer pressure. And peer pressure, while it has some advantages, is often very destructive of freedom. And I think there's no way around that in looking at the experience of many Americans now in 21st century life.
Yuval, I'm going to ask you a question that I get asked frequently. I'm on the radio every morning starting at 5 a.m., and people will routinely say to me, how do you do it? How do you not just want to, take a month off and find a sailboat somewhere and come back and see what's left when you come back? You sound so hopeful that, that there is that future out there. What drives that positivity to not just put this book together as a clarion call, but in general, so that our listeners can maybe find that in themselves?
Well, a sailboat does sound nice, but I am ultimately hopeful about America. I think that betting against this country has never been a good bet. And there are certainly a lot of reasons to worry now. There are certainly a lot of forces that are pressing in on us in ways that are very damaging and difficult. But I think that every rising generation of Americans ultimately wants for itself the promise that this country has offered every prior generation. And that desire, that hunger, is something that we can work with, is something that we can speak to. And by making freedom and dignity and community appealing, we can speak to that generation in ways that help it to get out of some of the ruts that our country is in. And so ultimately, it's an earnest thing to say, but look, I believe in America, and I think we're very lucky to be here, and there's nowhere you'd rather be in this moment in the history of the world. And so I do think that there's a lot of promise for us to work with despite all the enormous problems we confront.
Oh, believe me, I get on my knees and thank the Lord above that I was born in this country. I have so many friends who were born elsewhere and have gone through great measures to get here. That humbles me to the idea of we better make sure that this is around for other people who want to get here. But there is a quick one at the end here. We have a couple of minutes left. A lot of the rioting that we see around the country, I think the large number of the participants are being convinced by their own, circular poverty. They'll go into the organizers of these events will go into poor neighborhoods and say, "You're poor. It's because so and so has all the money and you don't have any of it. Let's go get it." You hear it politically. Mayor De Blasio of New York says, "Of course we're going to tax the hell out of them, and I'm going to build affordable housing in their neighborhoods and make them see it." And that's it. And it seems almost retributive. How do you? I guess it just takes a strong-willed person to not give in and say, "Oh gosh, this is all for naught."
Well, it's an old story, right? I think that the idea of the free society has always faced these challenges, has always faced these pressures, has always faced people who are motivated by some desire for justice and a better world, but who don't see how it is that we've achieved improvement over time, which is through the liberation of human potential and through the formation of civilized men and women. And they have to be shown that. Unfortunately, the human race tends to learn things the hard way, and we forget them too easily. Mm-hmm. And I do worry that we're going to have to learn these lessons the hard way again, having seen what happens in our cities when we let them fall into this kind of chaos and worked so hard for decades to recover those places and to strengthen our country and build up its potential again. We may have to find ourselves doing it yet again, but, the right answers are still right, and so they still will work, and the wrong answers will still fail. And ultimately, we've got to be there to clarify what the right answers look like.
Well, I appreciate you for putting this together. I forgot to ask in the distribution of the book, obviously the usual hard copy distributors, but can they also download this as an ebook, I presume, for Kindle?
Absolutely. Yep, you can find it on Amazon as an ebook and as an audiobook and all the usual formats.
Well, Yuval, God bless you. I don't know how old you are, but you sound young, so take that to the bank. But if you are young, that gives me great hope for the future as well. But thank you for putting this together. I'm getting copies for all my kids because I'm quickly discovering I've become that father, and I hope they all read it and consume it and get as much from it as I do. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning in. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, virginiainstitute.org, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.